The Microsoft versus FTC trial is a wrap, and while we don't have a ruling yet, we learned a lot of inside industry information that's not usually available to the public. From drama surrounding the exclusivity of Starfield and other Bethesda titles to the cost of producing AAA games like The Last of Us Part 2, there were plenty of bombshell reveals from this week's court battle. Here are 12 big things we learned from the Xbox versus FTC hearing. The entire Xbox Activision Blizzard saga has been filled with both Microsoft and Sony downplaying their respective achievements to appear as meek as possible to regulators. The FTC hearing was no exception, as the week kicked off with the news of Microsoft claiming that Xbox has officially lost the console wars. Microsoft claimed its original Xbox was crushed by Sony and Nintendo when it entered the market in 2001, and the company said it's been losing the console wars ever since. Citing numbers from 2021, Microsoft said Xbox held a 16% share of the console video game market. Xbox's Phil Spencer also said a piece on the console wars, calling it a, quote, social construct within the community during his testimony. Years of hardware shortages and a slew of cross-generation game releases can make it feel like this console generation just started. But the reality is that we're creeping up on the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X and S's third birthdays. In court documents reviewed by IGN, Microsoft is expecting the next generation, meaning the PlayStation 6 and Xbox Series Y, if you want to call it that, to begin in 2028. If Microsoft's projection remains accurate, that means we're just a year and a half away from the midpoint of this current generation. 2028 places the PS5 and Xbox Series on an 8-year cycle, which is 1 year longer than the PS4 and Xbox One, and roughly the same length as the Xbox 360 and PS3 generation. The last few years have seen the gaming industry's biggest players go on an acquisition spree. We've seen Sony acquire Bungie, Microsoft acquire Bethesda, and a lot more. But in court documents, we learned that Microsoft had plans for some big-name acquisitions that didn't end up happening. Namely, Microsoft had conversations about acquiring Sega, Square Enix, Zynga, and even Bungie before Sony bought them. But Microsoft's ambitions went well beyond these big players. Internal documents reveal a list of 100 developers Microsoft considered at one point before narrowing it down to 8 final candidates. This list included Hades developers Supergiant Games, Pokemon Go's Niantic, IO Interactive, and more. We've always known modern AAA games cost a ton of money to make, but now we have a good idea of just how expensive some of these games are. In a poorly redacted document submitted by Sony Interactive Entertainment, we learned The Last of Us Part 2 cost $220 million to develop, while Horizon Forbidden West cost $212 million. In the document, PlayStation said the costs are justified because AAA games, quote, create deep and ongoing engagements with players. These costs give more context to recent comments from Xbox Game Studios' Matt Booty, who said big-budget AAA games can take half a decade or more to make, and that failure can potentially ruin a studio. Unsurprisingly, Call of Duty was at the center of almost the entire courtroom battle over the past week. Activision's biggest asset came up repeatedly, with the FTC raising concerns about exclusivity or the potential of Activision releasing a worse version of Call of Duty on PlayStation. Call of Duty's impact makes sense, given that the same poorly redacted document from Sony revealed that Call of Duty generated over $800 million for PlayStation in the United States alone just in 2021. From Phil Spencer testifying under oath that Xbox will keep Call of Duty on PlayStation, to claims that Activision CEO Bobby Kotick threatened to pull Call of Duty from Xbox unless Microsoft granted Activision a higher revenue share, we learned a lot about the value of the franchise to both Sony and Microsoft. PlayStation boss Jim Ryan made it clear that he's not exactly a fan of Xbox's Starfield exclusivity. That being said, he admitted that he doesn't think it's anti-competitive. Publicly, PlayStation has been the biggest opponent of the Microsoft-Activision merger, but privately, it's a bit of a different story. In an email sent after Microsoft announced its intent to acquire Activision Blizzard, Ryan wrote, quote, "I'm pretty sure we will continue to see Call of Duty on PlayStation for many years to come," expressing that PlayStation would be more than okay if the transaction was approved. Starfield is coming out this September as an Xbox exclusive, but that wasn't always going to necessarily be the case. Xbox boss Phil Spencer confirmed that Starfield was potentially going to skip Xbox entirely prior to Microsoft's acquisition of ZeniMax. Xbox was worried about losing out on Starfield following PlayStation's exclusivity deals for Bethesda games like Ghostwire Tokyo and Deathloop. Spencer said Microsoft had to secure content for Xbox to, quote, remain viable in the business. Xbox did so by acquiring ZeniMax altogether, locking down Starfield and a whole lot more as an Xbox exclusive. The FTC tried to prove that Xbox's treatment of ZeniMax games could demonstrate how the company will handle exclusivity when it comes to Activision Blizzard games. One piece of evidence used was a chat exchange between Xbox's Tim Stewart and Matt Booty. The chat log focused on a November 2021 meeting where Phil Spencer apparently decided to make all future Bethesda games Xbox exclusives, not just new IP. Exclusives came up in a number of different ways during the hearing, especially with regard to ZeniMax. We learned that Machine Games' upcoming AAA Indiana Jones game was at one point set to be a multi-platform release before Microsoft's acquisition changed the plans. In terms of other future games, Spencer claimed that final decisions on platforms for upcoming Bethesda games like Obsidian's The Outer Worlds 2 and Bethesda Game Studios' The Elder Scrolls 6 have not been made yet. But with Spencer's apparent decision in mind, it seems like deciding Xbox exclusivity for these titles is more of a formality than an actual decision at this point. Speaking of The Elder Scrolls 6, don't expect to play the Skyrim follow-up anytime soon. We already knew that The Elder Scrolls 6 was set to be Bethesda Game Studios' next priority following Starfield, with Fallout 5 coming after that, but Spencer said the game is still, quote, 5+ years away. Well, do the math, and 5 years from now is 2028, which puts us in the window for the next console generation we discussed earlier. So it's possible that The Elder Scrolls 6 could be a cross-generation release, but it's also possible that it might skip this console generation entirely. For all the talk of exclusives, multiple industry figures took the stand to say they don't care for exclusives at all. Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella said he, quote, has no love for console exclusives, and that Microsoft plays the exclusive game to stay competitive with market leaders, aka Sony. Activision CEO Bobby Kotick agreed, saying making Call of Duty Xbox exclusive isn't in Activision's best interest, and it would actually be detrimental to business. Quote, you would alienate over 100 million monthly active players, Kotick said. Half of them play on phones, but the rest of them play on computer and PlayStation, and you would have a revolt if you were to remove the game from more than one platform. Gamers are very passionate, and so with that kind of investment, time, and effort, you get an enthusiastic, passionate group of people. PlayStation boss Jim Ryan had strong words for Xbox Game Pass, claiming he, quote, talked to all the publishers and they unanimously do not like Game Pass because it is value destructive. Ryan also claimed Game Pass is unprofitable for Microsoft. IGN reached out to Xbox for comment, and Xbox pointed out that every Game Pass title announced at the recent Xbox Game Showcase is coming from a creator that's previously worked with the subscription service. And there are multiple examples of publishers in favor of Xbox Game Pass, so it's not entirely clear who Ryan is referring to. We know that Activision's Bobby Kotick doesn't want to see his games on subscription services, as he said, quote, I don't agree with the idea of a multi-game subscription service as a business proposition going forwards, but we can agree to disagree, referring to Activision and Microsoft. The Nintendo Switch is an undeniable smash hit, but that wasn't obvious to everyone when Nintendo was emerging from the Wii U era in 2017. In fact, even Activision's Bobby Kotick underestimated the Nintendo Switch when he saw a prototype for the machine. Now he admits it was a mistake to not develop more software for Switch, and says Activision will consider putting a Call of Duty on future Nintendo consoles once they have the specs of the next device. There's a lot more to read about regarding this week's huge trial as we all await a ruling. Head on over to IGN.com for tons of in-the-courtroom reporting and expert analysis as we wait to find out what the future of Xbox, Activision, and Blizzard will look like. For all things in the world of gaming, stick with IGN.